Greetings, welcome to the studio. I'm Harry Fricker, and today I'll be introducing ideas and research informing the photographs of the body of work. The shadows of yesterday are the light of tomorrow. Before I start, I'll just like to tell you that I would like audience participation. I would like to actually you to interact as much as possible through chat. As in that way you'll be able to actually get much more out of this event. I'm more than willing. I'd be delighted to share my knowledge and skills with you during this time. So please ask questions. Also, feel free to chat amongst yourselves, right? If you actually want to start a thread, that's absolutely fine. If you remember to mark your questions with a capital Q at the front, that will be absolutely great, because then I'll be able to spot it immediately, straight away. So, without further ado, we'll make a start. I'll kick off with a presentation giving you a bit of background to the landscape, and then a brief introduction to the Neolithic. Literally, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour of the Neolithic, what it means, some of the key ideas, and then we're going to go into the actual body of work and look at the photographs themselves and discuss them as we go along. You're more than welcome to fire away questions as we actually go, so you don't have to wait until the end. So we can actually ask questions as we go. That's absolutely fine. I'll also leave some time for questions at the end, so we'll be able to have a proper Q&A as such. So without further ado, let's make a start. Okay. The shadows of yesterday are the light of tomorrow. Setting the scene, I think the first thing that I would like to point out is the landscape. What does this landscape involve? And then look at a little bit of the Neolithic. Bodmin Moor is in Cornwall, in the southwest of England. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. That means that it has the same status as a national park. It has a surface of approximately 80 square miles. And this is a quote that I'll read. It's one of the best preserved historic landscapes in Britain, with stone monuments dating back to the Neolithic, more than 5,000 years old. Now, that quote I actually read during my research. Is from one of the anthropological papers. And that really struck me. Somehow it resonated with me when I read that as part of my research, as I was informing myself about the history, the place, the landscape. That struck a chord. That quote struck a chord with me. And at that moment, I totally recognized that there might be a story here, the possibility to actually develop a story, because that is quite an achievement. Bodmin Moor is a highland moorland. It's rugged, it's hilly, it's got tors that are characteristic of this part of the world. Those tors have a granite base. And on the top of those tors or hills, what you find is the granite on top, the granite toppings, which is, whoops, sorry, I'm having problems with the presentation here. Just a second. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. Give us a second and I'll be able to sort this out soon. Bear with me. My PowerPoint presentation isn't working. Typical. Fortunately, I've got the backup here, so we should be able to be okay, I think. Okay. There. Yep. We've got it now. So the best preserved prehistoric landscape in Britain, with stone monuments dating back to the Neolithic, more than 5,000 years old. Now, Bodmin Moor is a rugged area. It's 80 square miles, and it's really rugged. And on top of the tors, you've got the remains of granite. Now, this is the granite itself is really, really, really ancient. It's about 500 million years old. It was magma that formed during while the Earth was actually forming. It's magma, Earth core that oozed out and solidified on the top. So you've got these amazing structures that have been weathered over millennia, over millions of years, and that create that eroded topping to the tors. And the tors are very characteristic of the southwest, both in Devon and in Cornwall. Here we are on Stowe's Hill, looking towards the west. So we are on the periphery, on the edge of Bodmin Moor. This is another view of Stowe's Hill, looking south, and you can see the granite formations in the front. They're actually quite extraordinary remains of from a different era. Now, it's this landscape that was inhabited by early Neolithic settlers, and all this area that I'm exploring through the photographs actually takes place here around the periphery, primarily of Row Tor, which is the second highest point in Cornwall, which is in the center of the screen in the distance. On the right, you have Brown Willy, which is the highest point. So it's a kind of rough land with no trees, or hardly any trees apart from the conifers that are new. And it's a kind of quite rough, evocative landscape. And I'm concentrating my photography around Row Tor. And what you see in the foreground is the remains of a Bronze Age or Neolithic hut. And you can see on the slopes of Row Tor, you can actually see a crisscross pattern. And they are plantation fields, agricultural fields that date back from the early Middle Ages, or probably even earlier, to the Bronze Age. They're significantly old. Now, one of the problems of working with this project is, for me at least, was the fact that what I'm trying to photograph isn't there, it's disappeared. There's nothing left, right, other than the archaeological remains, which is fine. But somehow, to me, the photographs needed something more, something that would actually communicate the feeling of place. And that is exactly what I was interested in, photographing, communicating the feeling of place. This is another part of a Neolithic remain, the last of the standing stones of an original stone circle. You can see a couple in the background that are actually reclining, and that have fallen over. In the background, you see the Brown Willy, the highest point in Bodmin Moor, in Cornwall, sorry. About the Neolithic, and this is literally going to be a whistle-stop tour of the Neolithic. We can date it to approximately 10,000 BC, and I think one of the key points is that the Neolithic is marks the agricultural revolution, the domestication and selective breeding both of plants and animals. By selective breeding, people, the emerging farming communities could actually up the yield of the production of both. And by having greater produce, they could actually store foodstuff, right? Both grain and cattle. And that gave the beginnings of trade. So there's where you actually have the very, very, very early beginnings of trade, around 10,000 BC. And that happens in the Middle East, the area that is today Egypt, going up north to where Israel and Palestine are, and then going east towards towards the present-day Iraq and Iran. It has the shape of a crescent moon. There's where you also get early civilizations, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, old civilizations. Now, one of the things about the Neolithic is the technology. This era is marked by technology. Simple technology, but technology nonetheless. They master pottery. Now, to master pottery, you have to master fire. Firing pots is a skill in itself. They could weave. They had woven materials, precious woven materials. You can imagine that weaving a blanket, for example, would have taken a huge amount of time, a huge investment in time and skill. So these objects would have actually been very, very important, with a huge value. Not necessarily a monetary value, but certainly a value of that isn't about money, but is about usage value itself. But there's also the value of the symbolic, and we'll come to that in a minute. They also are very skilled stone workers, stone masons. They produce stone tools. And bear with me a moment. I've got one here. This is an actual Neolithic tool. It's a sort of hammer that would have been used to crush stuff. But it's actually with these tools, having access to tools, stone tools changed everything, because all of a sudden they could work the land, they could also work wood, they could fell forests, they could clear areas, they could actually work stone, and it changed everything. I think the other important thing to note is that they had astronomy. They were developing astronomy, rudimentary, but nonetheless they had a body of knowledge. Astronomy formed an important part in being able to predict the trajectory of the sun, in being able to predict seasons, which is a key element when it comes to farming, planting, and planting seeds. Usually they reckon that seeds were planted during times of full moon. In terms of culture, Neolithic peoples had music, because they found musical instruments, again rudimentary musical instruments, but nonetheless, flutes, percussion instruments. They had art. Pottery has been recovered, and that pottery has actually abstract patterns on them, painted abstract patterns that are actually quite amazing. Usually geometric patterns of shapes, V-shapes, rectangles, but also circles and spirals. In terms of culture, one of the other things that they had was ancestor worship. Ancestor worship played a huge role in these communities. The stone circles played an important role in that part, and also communal burial chambers had a part in that. And finally, they had architecture, barrows, and the ceremonial stone circles. And it is this last part, the ceremonial stone circles and barrows, that I was interested in. It's the spiritual life that caught my imagination of this for this time. Here we are back to that slide where we have the landscape, and I mentioned earlier that this landscape was although photographing these images, the photographs were fine, but I felt dissatisfied because somehow they were too literal, they were too realistic, and they showed the place as it is, where I wanted to actually communicate a feeling about the space. So I started trying out different things, going in the evenings, at night time, and lighting the scene up. And this is one of my early test shots. This is a Neolithic Bronze Age site. It would have been a burial chamber. It would have been a mound of earth, and inside they would have actually put human remains and worship them. Notice that the roof is the roof of this structure actually has a hole, an orifice. That's another thing that characterized some of these stone monuments. They often put holes in stones. We don't know why. We don't know the significance of that. But these groups had a rich spiritual life that only possibly now we're beginning to understand. Again, back into the sacred and ceremonial landscape, the photographs of the day just didn't capture. There's a bleakness, there's an evocativeness, there's something that's rather poetic about it, but somehow it didn't actually fulfill the role of capturing the emotion of place. And through my experimentation, right, going at night, illuminating the stone circles. By the way, the previous slide is this monument here. This stone there is the same as that one. So you can see the difference between one and the other, between the daytime and the nighttime. The nighttime has a different sort of atmosphere. And this was one of the first shots that I made, still test shots, exploring the idea of using long exposures and artificial light, different types of artificial light, to see what I could actually do. And it was this one that actually gave me the key idea that this could actually be developed further, but it certainly needed work. From there I started photographing also the landscape in itself, and I wanted to photograph an area the landscape that was a dramatic landscape. So I was going during the day, going to these sites, exploring these sites, familiarizing myself with them, and getting to know the rhythm of the place, getting to know the feel of the place. This is an early morning shot. Again, all this area is actually used, is populated during the Neolithic era, and this is where you find the sacred and ceremonial spaces that they used for worship, ancestor worship. Again. And these shots, I've used them to actually set the scene, to get a kind of sense of the space, what it is at during the day, if you go there during the daytime. This is one of the stone circles, one of the larger stone circles on Bodmin Moor. In the background, Row Tor. And again, I wanted to actually move away from the idea of just being literal at photographing just a stone circle, because there's millions of photographs of those. And in a way, these photographs are realistic. They show the place, what it is, which is fine. But still, I wasn't happy with the way in which it actually conveys the idea of its history, of its other use. So then I started developing different techniques, and I was working with a couple of people as a collaborative venture, and I started using lights and movement to a greater degree. So now you already begin to see how the work is beginning to evolve, take on a different shape. This is the same stone monument, the quoit that we saw earlier, the one I mentioned that had the orifice, the perforation. Again, this is one of it's one of the same stones that we saw earlier by the side of Rautor, but this time it's illuminated, and I'm using a long exposure and using a number of different lights to light up the scene, and also include the stars. Again, here I'm shooting just on the edge of Bodmin Moor, by the River Foy, on a full moon. So here, what we see is it's not what we see actually is the full moon illuminating the sky, and it was a really bright full moon, and you can see the reflection on the water and the movement of the light. The idea of including light is to provide a kind of it's a metaphor for something else, for something other. And this is what I was trying to actually convey through the work. But I tell you what, I'll take a small pause for now, and maybe now would be a good time for questions. Have you got any questions, folks? Do you have any questions? The body of work is divided into four different galleries, and what I'm showing you here is a set of photographs from each one of the galleries. This is EXPANSE, where I'm looking at the relationship that they would have had with the Neolithic people would have had with the stars, with the cosmos. Right? And I think this is another thing about the stone circles, that they would have been used not just for ceremonial events, the sacred and the ceremonial, but also as measuring instruments to actually measure where the sun would come out, where the stars would be, where the galaxies would be. So there would be rudimentary instruments for measuring the sky, what was happening in this cosmos. The Milky Way had a huge significance, not just for Neolithic cultures here, but throughout. There's a huge connection between the Milky Way and a spiritual place. Future talks will actually be looking at guest speakers. The future guest speakers will actually be looking at the work of Carolyn Kennett. Well, she's an astronomer. She'll be looking at the impact of the stars and the role that astronomy had for Neolithic culture. Two standing stones, the pipers, their alignment is actually facing south, looking into the Milky Way. And the final gallery, Radiance. This is the latter part of work where I really began to get a feel and a strong understanding of the techniques I was actually applying and using. And this is where I really put everything all my skills and knowledge into developing this segment of the work. The stone that you see in the foreground is from the Hurlers, an incredible stone monument. It's actually 3 concentric stone circles, 3 rings. It's an incredible piece of work, and this particular one was actually repaired in the 1930s. You can actually see the concrete base where it was actually put into, and in the background you see a telecommunications mast and a few lights from the nearby village. Bodmin Moor is always being encroached by modernity, although it hasn't changed for hundreds of years, and possibly in some areas it hasn't changed for millennia. It's always being encroached. This green space is always being encroached by modernity. Again, another long exposure using 2 different light sources to illuminate the scene. And another one there. And again, what I'm trying to do here is actually bring in that notion of dance, festivity, that in a way is no longer there, is no longer evident. And another one here. In the background, the stars, the Big Dipper, Ursa Major, played a huge significance in Neolithic civilizations to actually look at the significance of the stars and track them. I'll just exit this to see if there's any questions. Oh, Dragana, thank you so much. There's a question here. Oh, amazing photos, Harry. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your comment, Dragana. It's great. Is there any evidence? I'll just bring this question here. Is there any evidence that the stone's orientation correlates to the stars? In some cases, yes, there's very clear evidence of that. Some of the stones actually point to where the sun sets and where the sun rises during the equinoxes and solstices. So those changes of the seasons are clearly defined in the positioning on the stone. So that is, definitely there without a shadow of doubt. Some of the stones also are used as markers on the landscape, in a way as to actually have as guides to the landscape. So they were multifunctional in that respect. Now, how much was actually, how deep was their observation of the stars? Well, that we're not entirely sure. We just know some of it, and I think really it's only recently that there's beginning to be more of an understanding of how these civilizations actually work, how these people actually work. Can you briefly talk about, this is another question from Valley P. Your work is beautiful. Thank you, Valley P. Can you briefly talk about your process of capturing these images? Yes. Well, I used long exposures on a tripod, and I used a whole variety of long exposures, trying to actually capture, because I'm photographing at night, so there is no light. So the camera would be set on a tripod always, and I use a timer to actually have a long exposure. And again, there's no hard and fast rule of photographing in those sorts of conditions. You have to make it up as you go along. There isn't a rule. It's not like photographing at daylight. During daylight, when you're well within the parameters of what the camera and its lighting metering system is able to do to function properly within that daylight. Once you start photographing at night, you're working in an area that is kind of uncharted. So you need to test, and you need to bracket your exposures and see how things are see how things develop as you go along in the field, of course. And then when you get back to your base, to your home, then you review your images and take the results from there, really. I'll carry on with looking at the light box. Another question. Dragana, how long ago was the archaeological excavation work carried out? That's an excellent question. It spans a number of years. The first kind of now, bear in mind that I'm not the expert here. It's our next, one of the next guest speakers, Jackie Nowakowski. She's an archaeologist and she's an expert in this field, and she'll be able to give you the exact dates. But for what I know, there were excavations early around 2014. 2014, there was a research around the hurlers in Bodmin Moor. That was what was very, very thorough. They discovered an avenue of stones, right, like a procession avenue amongst the stone circles. Now, they discovered that in about 2014. Before that, there were, I believe, in the 30s, in the 60s and the 30s, but also in the Victorians were digging around as well. So they've been digging around. Archaeologists have known about these spaces for for many years now, for well over a century. But new discoveries are always being made, new ways of dating, new ways of treating material. So this is an ongoing story. So yes, but I think really that question, we'll definitely ask that question to Jackie Nowakowski, because she will actually be able to give us very, very exact dates and a much better insight into the remains, the archaeological remains. I'll carry on with the last bit of my presentation. I'll share the screen again here with a light box. And what I've got here is, these are actual photographs. These are raw photographs, unedited, right, as they've been downloaded from the camera. And what you can see from top left, working our way to the right and then downward. You can, if you actually look at that sequence, you can actually see how the beginnings are rather tentative, doing some tests. The first image, the third frame is black. Basically, there's nothing there, or there's very, very little there. So the exposure was well out. And then I was illuminating the stones with a red light. And yes, the exposure was a bit better, but not quite there. So the second exposure, I adjusted the exposure and tried again, and yes, it was a bit better, but not quite, a bit over, not quite there. So basically you can see that there's an evolution of testing where to get the exposure, where do I get the exposure correct. And you can see that already in the second row, at the beginning of the second row, there's where I begin to actually get the correct exposure. So it took me about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 frames, 7 shots to actually get the exposure right. Bear in mind that by this time I already was experienced. I had a good feel of where the exposure is. It's about mastering technique. And once you actually begin to master techniques, you begin to work by a formula, so that then you have a good idea of where the exposure is, because you've been in that sort of situation before. So to begin with, photographing at night with artificial illumination like I've been doing, to begin with it's a little bit difficult, but you need to test, you need to persevere, and after that you begin to get a very strong feel what shutter speed to use, what ASA to use, and ISO to use, and so on. But you can see how my work in terms of illumination begins to actually gain confidence as you go along the strip. And if you actually look in the last two, at the bottom of the contact sheet, you can see that there is where I really go into town and I actually stick to my subject matter. And that's another important thing that I strongly recommend, and I do it. I actually, once I identify the potential of a photograph, I actually study the subject matter, right? So I make a number of photographs and I'll work my way around that subject matter as a way of exploring it until I actually get the photograph. You can see that particularly with that diamond-shaped stone that I identified, and I immediately saw that had potential, and I just went with it. I just worked with it, you know, from one to another, and then I photographed it on the third frame on its own, just illuminating it with a torch, but nothing else, to actually see what happened. And then I actually carried on evolving it, and you can see that it's at all the beginning of the frames are really no good. They're really kind of quite mediocre, not there. But you see that towards the end of the frames, that is when I actually begin to get the photographs that to my mind began to actually work to be more expressive of that spiritual, metaphorical experience of the stone circles. I'll just pause this a little moment and I'll go back to questions if you have any questions. I just realized that I was muted. My God. That's my mistake. I just realized that I was muted. Dragana, another interesting question. What's the longest exposure and ISO? I would understand it if it is the secret formula, not for sharing. Well, that depends. And to tell you the truth, I would prefer for you to actually explore this parameter. I've given you clues that you have to up the ISO, you have to use a higher ISO, and that depends how high that may be, but you have to use a higher ISO in order to make the light sensitive surface more sensitive to light. right? And then you'll have to work with longer shutter speeds, certainly longer than a second, a number of seconds, and maybe even longer than that, but certainly a number of seconds. And with regards to the aperture, you'll have to work with wider apertures in order to compensate for the amount of light that comes in. So it's wide apertures. I tend to work on 5, 6, 8, 4, right? Because I don't want to, because of the depth of field, I'm trying to maintain as much of a depth of field as I possibly can. So in terms of the shutter speeds that I would use longer shutter speeds to actually allow time to create those streaks of light, those not just painting with light, but also to create the streaks of light. And with regards to the ISO, I would actually work as high as possible, but minimizing, trying to get the least amount of noise as possible. So that was. So you need to balance those things, and I would encourage you to actually take that as a bit of a voyage of discovery. Discover through yourself what is it? What are the situations that you're actually photographing, and as much as you can, make it up as you go along. So that would be my advice. But if you do get stuck, give me a call. You can always drop me an email. So that would be absolutely fine. Any other questions? The only ingredient missing is the Devon clear sky. That yes, the Devon and Cornwall clear sky. Absolutely, yes, indeed. That makes a big difference, definitely. Let me share the screen again, and I'll go to the last part. And please, while you're there, please put your questions through, and I'll be delighted to answer them. I'll just share the screen again. Okay, this is talking of skies. Just checking that I have the audio right. Yes, the audio is fine. Talking of skies, here we are. These are the skies over Bodmin Moor. And here again, I'm showing you this as a way of showing you, I don't just take the one photograph, I take series of photographs. I bracket my exposures, right? I use different shutter speeds. I use a number of, I take a whole series of photographs. Sometimes I'll bracket, sometimes I won't, but I noticed even using a tripod that there can be slight judder even using a tripod, especially in this part of the world, in open spaces where you actually get quite a lot of wind or strong breeze. That can actually cause even slight camera movement that will actually have an impact on the quality of your image. So it's always best to shoot series, more than one. And here what I'm doing is, again, I found the subject matter and then exploring the subject matter. And these are, you can see that on the top, the top 1.5 rows, it's the same stone, and I'm just exploring that stone, which is the right photograph, and looking at slight variations between one and the other, shifting the horizon, getting in slightly closer, getting in further away, changing my angle so that the shadow that is being cast is in a different place. And you can see that I've indicated a few with 5 stars. There's the second frame, there's the second from the end in the top row, and then there's the last one of that series in the middle of the second row. But you can see from those frames, I've only selected 3 that were the possibles, but really there's one that makes it in the end, and that is the middle frame marked with the 5 stars. That is the one that that made it to the exhibition. So most of the shots that I'm actually taking never see the light of day, really. They're simply not there. Either because the photograph isn't actually quite there and doesn't communicate what I want it to communicate, or there's a bit of blur, there's a bit of judder, and it's not quite there. And also, what in this type of photography, what I've noticed is that I'm leaving a lot of random elements to happen, especially in the night shots. There's an awful lot of random elements going here, and this is one of the things about that I quite like, actually, because I never know what's going to happen. I never know what I'm going to be photographing, how it's actually going to be recording on the chip. And that is that part of that actually I find quite fascinating, because it's a discovery, and I would encourage you to actually go in that voyage of discovery in whatever project you are doing, and do your research in terms of what you're photographing, but also understand your subject matter, ways of representing your subject matter as you want to actually explore it. And it truly is an exploration. And in that exploration, you will also be exploring yourself from the creative perspective. And you will be using different skills and resources that probably you didn't even know you had until you're actually faced with a problem. And it's about problem solving, ingenuity, and creativity. So I would strongly suggest that you actually take that approach that is about discovery, which is what I've been doing with this photographic body of work. It's very much a voyage of discovery. Any other questions, folks? I'll wait for your questions. No other questions? Andrea B, great presentation and beautiful photographs. Thank you. Excellent. Tell me, Andrea B, which do you think? What are your favorite photographs? I would be interested to know what photographs do you think are the ones that somehow hit the mark the most for you? Dragana. Do you use polarizing filter for night photography? No, I don't. I don't use any filter at all. Normally for daytime shots, I always use a polarizing filter. I use a polarizing filter all the time for day shots because that's the way it is. The polarizing filter will actually have a number of effects. On the one hand, it will actually increase your contrast, right? So if there's so it'll increase the contrast, and by increasing contrast, you create the idea of sharpness as well. So if you up the contrast, then images, objects within the image will actually appear. It's the illusion of sharpness. But the other thing that the polarizing filter has, it darkens blue, right? So blue light is darkened. Therefore, your skies will be darker, and if they're clouds, there'll be a darker blue, basically, rather than a pale, washed out, overexposed blue. And by darkening blue, your white clouds will actually appear whiter, and therefore because it's also increased a bit of contrast. And overall, what I find from the polarizing filter is that it makes the images more crisper. However, there are limitations to a polarizing filter. Ideally, a circular polarizing filter, where you actually have to rotate, it's two lenses sandwiched, right? And you have to rotate the one in front, right, in order to actually get the right angle, get the right angle of the polarizing effect. What it does, the polarizing filter, in effect, cuts off stray light. Therefore, it cuts off reflection, right? And in doing so, if you shoot water or any surface that is reflective, by moving the ring around the polarizing filter, you actually get rid of reflections because you're able to order, right, those rays of light coming into your camera. And one of the things about light into your camera, stray light will actually reduce contrast. So it will actually wash out, stray light will actually wash out your image. Again, one of the things that I use, and I'll show you, I've got here. I always use a lens hood to cut stray light, because if stray light, this is a polarizing filter I've got there, right? And you can see that I'm turning the filter, right? And this is how I actually control the light. Stray light will actually reduce your contrast, and then that's problematic. So this is why I always use a hood, a lens hood, all the time when I'm shooting during landscapes during the day. It also gives a bit of added protection, right? And also using a filter also gives you a bit of added protection to the lens, because any kind of damage to the lens would absolutely be fatal. That would be the end of the lens. So, to go back to your question, Dragana, no, I don't use a filter at night. I don't use any filter at all at night. I actually have the raw lens itself, just the lens surface on its own, to actually get the maximum amount of light striking into the sensor. Oh, thank you, Daniel Ratcliffe. Much appreciated. Great presentations and photos. Thanks. You're welcome. My pleasure, Daniel. Excellent. And Dragana, thank you. Well, thank you for being here. And on that note, we'll finish tonight's presentation. Thank you so much. Don't forget that there's a series of talks following this presentation. Next week, we have Philip Marsden talking about the spirit of place on Bodmin Moor. He's an author, lives in Cornwall. He's written the book Rising Ground, which is really, really interesting, and he's a really, really interesting person to speak to. After that, we have Francis Liddell, who will be speaking on NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And then we have Jackie Nowakowski, the archaeologist, and she's an expert in her field. And last but not least, we have Carolyn Kennett, who's an archaeoastronomer. So she'll actually be looking at the sky during actually Neolithic times. And finally, let me just say this. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate you taking time to be here. And oh, another comment. Taj, thank you so much. It's It's been a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for being here. The gallery, HF Studio, will actually be a gallery that will open up for people to submit work and have a series of exhibitions and talks on the gallery. So that is going to be developed over the coming weeks. So that the HF Studio is going to be an exhibition space specializing in photography, culture, technology, and NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And on that note, I'll say goodbye. Thank you so much, and hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye for now. Remember to like the presentation. It's going to be on YouTube Live. Do subscribe if you actually can. Do visit the website. Do visit the website and you do follow us online as well on across social media, and book your next tickets for the next presentations online. Bye for now. Have a very good evening. Thank you.